Have you ever walked into a room filled with laughter and bright lights, yet felt nothing but emptiness inside? You stood there, still breathing, still forcing a smile, still keeping up appearances, but deep down, you knew no one truly saw you. Not because you were invisible, but because everyone was too busy living in their own world. They didn't see how much you were holding in. They didn't notice the fear you were hiding. And then one day, you stopped waiting for them to look back. Not because you gave up, but because you woke up to the truth. No one is coming to save you, and you no longer need them to. In a society where people chase validation like oxygen, you suddenly feel a strange relief when you realize no one truly cares how you're living. No one is keeping a scorecard of your failures. No one is grading your life. And that exact moment when you stop performing, stop proving, stop trying to become a socially acceptable version of yourself is when you begin to walk. No longer living for someone else's gaze. No longer waiting to be understood. You live for yourself, for the values you believe in, for the peace that needs no applause. In this video, we won't learn how to stop caring, but how to stand firm. Not how to isolate ourselves, but how to remain steady in solitude. Because when you accept that you only have yourself, that is not weakness. That is strength. When you let go of the need for recognition, you begin to see what truly deserves your respect. And when you stop waiting for someone to stand by your side, you'll learn how to stand tall even on your own. That is the Stoic spirit and the path back to a self you've abandoned for far too long. 1. The prison in your mind never had walls. There are prisons that need no bricks, no guards, no judgment from anyone else. They are built quietly, day by day, with your own fear. It's the feeling that you must live a certain way just to avoid disappointing others. It's the mornings when you wear a shirt, not because you like it, but because it looks appropriate. It's when you stay silent, though you want to speak, afraid they'll think you're a bother. It's the nights you lie awake not from insomnia, but from replaying a moment in the day when you acted a little different. That prison isn't outside. It's inside your mind. And the terrifying part is, you don't realize you're living in it until you can no longer breathe. What holds you back isn't other people, it's the belief that other people are watching. You live as if the whole world is a stage and everyone's judging you. You tense up so no one misunderstands you, act normal to avoid being labeled weird, and try to please people who don't even care about you. But the truth is, no one's watching you as closely as you think. They don't have the time to track your every move, every word, every mistake. Because they're too busy fighting their own shadows. What they care about most, just like you, is themselves. And no matter how hard you try, you'll never be the center of someone else's emotional map. You're a side character in their world, but you've made them the judge in yours. Marcus Aurelius said something every modern person needs to remember. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That quote isn't meant to make you indifferent. It's meant to help you see that the place you feel trapped in might not be real. You think others are watching you, but that's just the echo of your own insecurity. You think their eyes are full of judgment, but it's a gaze you've projected onto them. The criticism you fear most of it was never even said. The laughter you think is aimed at you might have nothing to do with you, and the expectations you carry so heavily could be pure imagination. Freedom doesn't come when you finally please everyone. Freedom comes the moment you accept one truth. You don't need permission to live right. The walls around you weren't built by others, they were built by you, every time you denied yourself just to feel accepted. You call it caution, politeness, diplomacy. But if you have to sacrifice who you are to fit in, that's no longer character. It's confinement. A prison built from forced consent, constant performance, and polite silence. And that prison, ironically, is decorated with praise, but inside, it slowly corrodes your self-respect. The most frightening thing isn't being limited by others. It's when you limit yourself just to avoid being judged. You avoid dreams out of fear of failure. You delay action out of fear of criticism. You suppress emotions out of fear of appearing weak. And gradually, you forget who you once were, what you once wanted, what you once dared to imagine. You become so cautious that you lose your courage, so understanding that you abandon yourself. You live as a safe copy instead of a brave original. But the moment you look back and see the truth, the walls in your mind begin to crack. You realize you owe no one an explanation for your own life. You realize you don't need to perform, don't need to shrink, don't need to censor yourself just to be easier to accept. And the strange thing is, when you stop living for outside approval, you begin to radiate an energy others can't ignore. Not because you're trying to impress, but because you're no longer afraid to disappoint. Not because you're rebellious, but because you've stopped compromising. Not because you've become special, but because you dared to become yourself again. When you stop bowing to invisible expectations, you begin to stand tall as a free person. No one can control your mind unless you let them in. No one can shrink your life unless you hand over the wheel. And no one can save you if you don't rise from the seat where you condemned yourself. A Stoic is not someone without fear. They are someone who knows fear but doesn't let it dictate their path. They don't tear down walls with screams but with quiet resolve. They don't need someone to unlock the gate because the key has always been in their hands. 2. The audience you're performing for never existed. But beyond the prison in your mind lies an even subtler illusion. The feeling that you're constantly being watched. An invisible stage you've built yourself, with imagined spotlights, imagined eyes, and an audience you believe is waiting to judge your every move. You're not just confining yourself. You're living like an actor, one who's not allowed to step out of character. And ironically, the better you perform, the harder it becomes to find the way out. Sometimes you walk into a room, and before anyone speaks, you've already adjusted your posture, your tone, your facial expression as if you were facing a panel of judges. You share something personal, then instantly regret it for fear of saying too much. You post a status, then delete it, not because it's wrong, but because you fear it might be misunderstood. You live as if someone is always observing, analyzing, judging you. But the truth is, no one pays as much attention to you as you think. No one has the time or energy to be a full-time spectator in your life. They're too busy managing the drama in their own. That's what most young people don't realize. It's not the world making you feel seen, it's you projecting that gaze onto everyone. And in doing so, you become the one operating the spotlight, shining it on yourself, then panicking from the exposure. But in reality, the theater is empty. The anxiety you feel doesn't come from a crowd, it's the echo of your own mind. When you stop imagining an audience watching you, you'll realize no one's watching at all. They're not there. They never were. Marcus Aurelius once said, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks." That wasn't the advice of someone cold. It was the awakening of a man who carried an empire and still chose to protect his inner calm. He understood that the only thing you can control is how you act, not how others react. And freedom only arrives when you stop trading pieces of yourself to please someone who was never truly present. When you perform, you live in a split state. One part is your true self, yearning to live honestly. The other is the version you believe others want to see, always adjusting, always guarded, always calculating. These two parts never align. They clash, contradict, and drain you. That's why you feel lost. That's why you feel empty even when many like you. And that's why you can't feel genuine joy, because there is no real audience listening to the real you. Ironically, the moment you stop performing, you become more compelling. Not because you found a better role, but because you stopped playing one altogether. Your directness becomes your magnetism, your calm becomes your strength, and your imperfections become what others trust. Because in a world where everyone pretends to be fine, the one who admits they're not is the one people actually believe. You don't need to impress. You only need to show up as your original self. And you don't have to withdraw from the world. Living authentically doesn't mean isolation, but you must learn the difference between sharing and showing off, between connection and performance, between being kind and needing to be seen as kind. A Stoic doesn't live to be accepted. They live in a way that they can respect themselves. That is the only standard you need. And slowly, you'll begin to realize you don't need anyone's approval to be yourself. You don't need the crowd's attention to feel worthy. And you no longer need to keep performing, because that stage exists only in your imagination. Step down, leave the role, and you'll see the world hasn't turned its back on you. It never noticed you as much as you thought, but that's not a tragedy. That's a gift. You're allowed to be wrong, allowed to change, allowed to live an imperfect but honest life. And when you live truthfully, only then can real relationships form. Only then can real conversations unfold. And only then does a real life, a life no longer terrified of judgment, begin to open up. 3. Mistakes are not monuments. When you stop performing, you begin to hear the sounds inside yourself, the echoes of the past, the mistakes you've made, the wounds not yet healed, but covered with busyness. The silence of real life, no longer filled with roles and expectations, confronts you with everything you once avoided. And most of that is the fear of being defined by your own mistakes. We live with memories as if walking along a path of monuments. Every stumble, every wrong word, every failure etched in your mind as an unbreakable landmark. You remember every look that made you feel small, every word that cut deep, every decision you regret. You don't just remember, you revere them, as if mistakes are proof of your unworthiness and you must forever bow to them. But the truth is, those mistakes are not monuments unless you build them and kneel before them every day. Think of one mistake that still haunts you, a careless comment, a broken promise, an impulsive choice that hurt someone. How long have you repeated it silently in your mind? How long have you used it to remind yourself you're not enough? And now ask yourself, if someone else made that same mistake, would you be as harsh on them? Likely not. You'd understand. Forgive, maybe even forget, but with yourself, you don't allow it. Because somewhere in your mind, you still believe perfection is a prerequisite for love. And once you fail, you're no longer worthy. Seneca was exiled, betrayed by the very man he served. He could have drowned in bitterness, but instead of erecting a monument to humiliation, he used the years that followed to write words that would illuminate thousands of years after. He understood, mistakes are not the end. They are simply turns on a path no one walks in a straight line. And only when you stop too long at a bend, turning it into a residence, do you become truly stuck. You weren't born to avoid mistakes. You were born to learn from them. And if you truly learn, then that mistake is no longer a failure, it becomes fuel. Every crack in the wall you once built is now a slit of light showing you the way out. Every flaw that once broke you is now a reminder of the strength it took to rise again. But the only condition is, stop framing them like relics. Allow them to pass instead of displaying them as a permanent verdict hanging over your head. Look at the people you admire. They didn't get where they are because they never failed. Quite the opposite. They've made more mistakes than you know, but they didn't let those define them. They fell, but didn't name themselves after the fall. They erred, but didn't let the error determine their worth. That's the difference between someone who matures and someone who lives in guilt. One learns, the other hides. One accepts imperfection, the other tries to mask it forever. There will be people who bring up your past mistakes not to help you grow, but to keep you beneath them. Don't listen and don't react. Because when you truly accept your past, no one can use it to shame you anymore. You regain control when you stop feeling indebted for your own humanity. You don't have to erase the past, you only have to look at it with calm eyes. It happened, you learned, and you are no longer that person. True freedom begins the moment you stop visiting the monuments of your mistakes each day. You begin to choose your direction instead of turning back in nostalgia. You begin to act instead of regret. You begin to live instead of trying to repair your image. No one gets far by staring into the rearview mirror, and no one finds happiness by living like they're paying for a crime. Forgive yourself, not because you are innocent, but because you are now awake enough not to repeat it. 4. Freedom comes from choosing what to care about. When you stop building monuments to your mistakes, you finally make room inside for something else. But that space won't wait for you to be ready. If you don't consciously fill it with awareness, it will once again be occupied by meaningless concerns, the noise from outside, events irrelevant to your values, stories unworthy of your emotional investment. And you'll find yourself trapped in a new form of slavery, emotional slavery to things that do not deserve your energy. Modern people don't lack energy, they lack discernment. You might spend hours scrolling through others' lives, analyzing what they say, reacting to what they do while completely neglecting your own emotional state, forgetting the truly important things that need your presence. You care about what strangers think of you, but never sit still long enough to hear your own thoughts. You get swept away by praise, criticism, recognition, and rejection, yet can't spare 5 minutes to ask, what actually matters to me? Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." In that short sentence lies a decisive cut. He didn't care whether you could persuade anyone. He only cared whether you lived by what you believed. And that only happens when you learn the art of choosing what's worth your attention. Not everything deserves a reaction. Not every word needs a reply. Not every glance deserves interpretation. Freedom isn't when no one disturbs you. It's when you no longer grant everything the power to disturb you. Have you ever felt drained after a day, even though nothing serious happened? Perhaps it wasn't because you did too much, but because your mind was stretched by too many petty, unrelated things. A strange look, a rude comment, a piece of negative news, an unnecessary email. All of these become energy thieves, little by little. And because you didn't filter them out, you gave everything permission to touch you. Like holding a limited amount of money, if you give it away to hundreds of people who don't matter, you'll have nothing left for those who truly do. Your mind works the same way. When your attention is spread too thin, you lose depth and presence in everything. Your family gets only a fragment of you. Close friends only see a tired version of you, and you lose the ability to connect with the values that give your life meaning. The Stoics called this the distinction between what is within your control and what is not. You can control how you think, how you respond, how you choose, how you act with kindness. You cannot control others' moods, society's judgment, or the outcome of things beyond your reach. If you focus your attention on the latter, you won't have the energy left to live out the former. And that turns you into a puppet living by reaction instead of direction. Start by asking a question every time your mind begins to spiral over something. Does this deserve my peace? Is this concern helping me grow? Become more courageous, more honest, more aligned with my values? If not, let it go, not because you're heartless, but because you need to protect your inner strength for the right people, the right work, the right values. That's not selfishness, that's discipline. You don't need to stretch yourself thin trying to care about everything. You only need to live fully for a few right things, the things that make you someone you can be proud of. Kindness, when chosen and nurtured in the right place, is more powerful than kindness scattered so thinly no one feels it. Your presence, when fully given to what matters, creates true connection, not the hollow participation in hundreds of unnecessary conversations. And then you'll see, you don't need to care about everything to be a person of value. You only need to care rightly to live without regret. 5. The invisible judge in your mind deserves to retire. Once you've learned to filter what's worth your attention, you begin reclaiming space in your mind, but that's only half the journey. Because even after you shut out the noise of the world, One voice remains the relentless voice inside your head that never stops, never approves, always evaluates, compares, scores, and deducts. That is the invisible judge you've nurtured for years, and it's time to let it retire. No one taught you to build an inner critic, but you built one anyway, piece by piece. Every time you were criticized, you remembered. Every time you were praised, you recorded it. And slowly, you started living as if a silent scorecard had to be maintained. You judged yourself through others' reactions. You gave too much meaning to their looks, their comments, even their silence, as if life were an exam and every moment was under review. But you forgot one thing. No one is actually grading you except yourself. Seneca once wrote, "Every man is a slave of fear." For many, that fear is not meeting expectations, not being good enough, not being recognized. And when that fear sinks in, it creates an invisible habit. You begin calculating every action like a move on a chessboard. Every conversation becomes a test. Every sharing becomes a presentation. Every failure becomes a deduction on an imaginary report card. And slowly, you burn out, trying to maintain a score no one else even sees. The bitter truth is, the judge in your head never rests. It isn't fair. It lacks compassion. It never acknowledges effort, it only sees results. It doesn't remember what you've overcome, only what you still lack. Worse, it doesn't operate on your standards, but borrowed standards from society, family expectations, norms you never agreed to, but silently obeyed. You become a competitor in a contest you never chose, but still feel like you're losing. Letting that judge retire doesn't mean giving up or becoming careless. On the contrary, it's when you start living with true intention. You shift from living to score points, to living to understand, to feel, to be present. You begin measuring yourself not by approval, but by the alignment between your actions and your values. You no longer ask, "Do they like me?" But instead, "Am I living in accordance with what I believe?" That's when comparison turns into awareness. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, not for praise, but to reflect with himself each day. He didn't need society's scoreboard. He needed truth. And truth doesn't require grading, it only requires being seen. When you live this way, every day becomes a chance to adjust, to try again, to be more honest, not a high-stakes final exam. Letting go of the judge in your head doesn't mean abandoning growth. On the contrary, that's when real growth becomes sustainable. Because you no longer learn to outshine others, no longer work to prove something, no longer live to impress. You learn to understand. You work to contribute. You live to mature. And that creates a different kind of energy, one that's calm, deep, and free, untouchable by praise or blame. You'll begin to see others differently. When you stop scoring yourself, you stop harshly judging others. You become more compassionate not because you've gone soft, but because you understand the cost of harshness. You realize everyone's battling their own internal critic. And sometimes, the best thing you can do for someone is not add fuel to their self-doubt. Eventually, you'll realize life is not a competition. There are no titles, no rankings. No one is truly keeping score. And you don't need to win to live a meaningful life. You just need to quietly do what's right, in the way you believe is right. Because the real reward isn't recognition, it's peace when you can face yourself without shame. And that only comes when you allow the judge to step down for good. 6. The only mirror worth looking into. When you allow the judge in your mind to retire, a silence emerges, and you suddenly realize you need another anchor to know who you are, where you're heading, and whether you're living true to yourself. The problem is, you've spent too long looking into distorted mirrors. Mirrors from social media, from others' gazes, from shifting praise or criticism, all reflecting a fragmented, warped image that constantly changes with the mood of the one holding the mirror. And if you keep looking into those mirrors, you will always find yourself lacking. The only mirror worth looking into is the one within the place that holds the values you believe in, the boundaries you accept, the choices you're willing to carry. It's not the image you construct to be accepted by others, but the raw reflection of a human trying to live with integrity, with depth, with discipline and conscience. That mirror doesn't reflect appearances, it reflects intent. It doesn't care about results, it focuses on how you acted when no one was watching. That is the one place where you cannot pretend. Epictetus lived as a slave, yet his thinking was so free that even those in power had to bow to it. He understood. True value doesn't come from what others see in you, it comes from what you see in yourself. Once you learn to turn inward to observe, you'll no longer feel lost in the gaze of others. Because the eyes of the world change easily, but your conscience, if you learn to protect it, becomes the compass that never betrays. You may be loved today and forgotten tomorrow. You may be celebrated in one moment and judged in the next. But the inner mirror does not shift like that. It is not swayed by rumors, trends, or silence from the crowd. It simply and quietly reflects exactly who you are and whether you're living up to what you once promised yourself. That's what Marcus Aurelius did when he wrote in his journals, not for others to read, but to keep his mind grounded in its core. No one praised him for that while he was alive, but that's why he is honored long after he's gone. When you look into the right mirror, you stop blaming yourself for not being recognized. You begin to understand that real recognition is not found under stage lights, but in the peace you feel when you know you haven't betrayed yourself. You don't need to stand before a crowd to know your worth. You only need one moment to look deep within yourself and not feel ashamed. That mirror doesn't need anyone else to nod. It needs you to nod to yourself. And once you begin to live by that honest reflection, something strange happens. You grow stronger without straining. You become humbler without being weak. You become clearer even when the world remains blurry. Because you no longer need anyone to tell you how to live, you've found a place to measure yourself. The one mirror you can trust for the rest of your life. 7. True power comes when you no longer need to be seen, once you've grown accustomed to looking into the only mirror that matters. The one that reflects your inner values. Instead of judging your surface, you'll come to realize a deeper truth. You don't need to be seen to make an impact. In fact, it's often when you stop craving attention that true influence begins. Like the roots buried deep underground, no one praises them, No one sees them, yet they're what nourish the entire tree that proudly reaches toward the sky. We live in an age where everything seems to demand exposure. Thoughts must be shared, actions must be recorded. Even kindness needs acknowledgement. But this need for recognition dilutes the weight of what we do. A right action done to impress will never have the depth of a quiet act driven purely by conviction. When you act, not because you want others to know, but because you cannot not act, that is where power begins to form. Marcus Aurelius never wrote his journals intending them to become philosophy books. He wrote in the dark, alone, amid battles, amid disappointment, in moments where he had only himself and his reason. Yet what he wrote with no audience became a compass for millions across thousands of years. He didn't try to leave a legacy, but he left one. Because he lived truthfully, lived rightly, lived deeply. You can do the same. You don't need applause to feel worthy. You don't need to be seen to know your actions matter. True power comes when you quietly pass through others' lives and leave something good behind without needing them to remember your name. When you stop trying to stand out, you begin to stand for something deeper. When you stop trying to be inspired, you unintentionally become a source of inspiration. Power doesn't come from the crowd. It comes from the alignment between the values you hold and the actions you take even when no one is watching. A timely word. A quiet choice for kindness. An act of integrity that never gets mentioned. These are expressions of invisible power, a power that doesn't need microphones or spotlights, but touches people in a way that silence can carry. Seneca wrote letters to Lucilius, not to become a quoted philosopher, but simply to share a perspective. But his sincerity without performance, without show, without pressure, has echoed to this day. That is the art of invisible influence, an influence untouched by the need to prove, coming from a strength secure enough to need no validation. When you live this way, you'll see even your smallest actions become declarations. Not because you're trying to make a statement, but because how you live is clear enough that others see it and reflect. You don't preach, you embody. You don't push, you guide. And the strangest thing is, the less you care about being watched, the more people begin to listen. Because they see in you something the world is missing, a presence that doesn't need noise, a truth that doesn't need a spotlight. I used to think I had something to prove. Every time I failed, I carried the shame as if the whole world was watching. I stayed silent, not because I understood myself, but because I was afraid others would find out I wasn't good enough. I used to live as if there were an invisible camera following every step, every mistake, every moment of hesitation in my voice. And so I performed. I behaved strategically. I chose my words carefully, not to communicate, but to avoid being judged. But the more I did that, the further I drifted from myself. The more I tried to be recognized, the emptier I felt. Until one day, I sat alone in a quiet room, no social media, no messages, nothing left to impress anyone. I looked back at the week that had passed and realized I had lived the whole week for others, but not for a single second for myself. From that day on, I stopped trying to be seen. I chose to live rightly even if no one noticed. And strangely enough, from that day on, I began to feel free. If what I've said resonates with something inside you, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content. This is not a channel meant to dazzle you. It's a place to return to when you're tired of pretending to be someone else. Remember, you don't need to be seen to have power. You just need to live true enough not to betray yourself. See you in the next video.